Good morning. He and I have decided that we're going to start the hearing early, and since y'all are here, or since you're here, is that all right with you?
Sounds just great.
We all know Social Security provides important retirement and disability benefits that millions of Americans rely on. Yet, as we will hear it again today, Congress needs to act so we can be sure that those benefits will be there for our children and our grandchildren, just like they are for seniors and individuals with disabilities today. Today we'll hear from Social Security Chief Actuary about the findings in this year's report. And while the report had some good news for the disability insurance program, make no mistake, Social Security faces serious challenges. The trustees' report tells us the Social Security trust funds will be exhausted in 2034. At that point, individuals face across-the-board benefit cuts if Congress doesn't act. Once the trust funds are exhausted, Social Security will only be able to pay 77% of promised benefits. That's wrong and simply unacceptable. The trustees also tell us today it would take $12.5 trillion to make Social Security solvent over the next 75 years. That's not a little number. And the number gets bigger every year. In 2011, when I first held a hearing on the trustees' report, it was $6.5 trillion. Fixing Social Security will require tough choices that will affect the lives of millions of Americans, and I can tell you they aren't easy choices. And we all may have differing views on how to solve it, but not talking about the problem won't make it go away. And if we wait until the trust funds are exhausted, the choices become more difficult and or some of the options won't be on the table any longer. Last December, I introduced my plan to fix Social Security. My good friend from Connecticut, Mr. Larson, also has a plan, and I appreciate my friend's recognition that Social Security is in trouble, and we need to fix it. While our plans are very different, they both fix Social Security permanently. I believe any plan to fix Social Security should do so permanently. Social Security is too important not to give workers and their families that certainty. It's not enough to just push out the trust fund exhaustion date by a few years. When Congress acts, we need to be sure we finally got Social Security on the right track for good. In addition to permanently fixing the program, I believe Social Security solvency should meet the following principles. First, it should modernize Social Security to reflect today's workers and their families. Second, it should reward hard work. Third, it should protect the most vulnerable. And lastly, it should improve retirement security. Millions of Americans rely on this important program now, and millions more pay in with the expectation of future benefits. Congress has a responsibility to the American people to make sure that our children and grandchildren can count on Social Security just like seniors and individuals with disabilities do today. We need to take this responsibility seriously, and that's why this subcommittee will continue to talk about Social Security solvency and the cost of delay. Americans won't need and deserve nothing less. I now recognize Mr. Larson for his opening statement.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and we are in concurrence. We could give one another speeches, I think, at this particular excuse me, at this particular point, and as we like to say often, Congress should be about the vitality of ideas, and I commend the chairman because he has been a stalwart in making sure that we address this issue. And this, his last term in Congress, we're especially heartened by the fact of his determination to put forward legislation that will meet the test of the 75-year requirement. And while the news that we received today is better than some might have expected, especially on the disability side, it does remain, as the chairman has pointed out, our desire, and I believe that to be true of everybody on the committee, to reach a conclusion where we make this solvent into the future for all generations. And to the chairman's point, we do have plans competing, but with the general concept in mind that we want to make Social Security solvent into the next century. We believe that we have to enhance Social Security along the way. We think it's unacceptable that for many people, especially working women, that they retire into poverty. We think it unacceptable that our COLAs have been determined by a CPI that doesn't actually reflect what the real costs that the elderly incur are. We think it unacceptable that we haven't really changed Social Security since 1983. It's an insurance program. Have any of your insurance premiums gone up since 1983? Of course they have. And so we think that it's vitally important to make sure, especially with the solvency, that we look at this and combine both the old age and retirement and disability together, and then provide the actuarial assistance to make sure the program is solvent. We believe to do that we have to increase the contribution to the fund. These are difficult choices, as Mr. Johnson has indicated. But if you phase that in over 25 years, we would in essence be doing what should have been done in '83. Index this in a way so that there was gradually, as it kept pace with the actuarial concerns of a population, the modest increases that would be necessary. This takes us into well beyond the 75-year period by following these adjustments, and also making clear that we need to enhance the program on behalf of so many beneficiaries. We also believe that many seniors who find themselves in the workforce deserve a tax break. And by indexing this appropriately from what was done in 1983 to, as Mr. Johnson says, what needs to be done today to modernize it. We have a lot of talent on this committee and many individuals, as we listen to some of the concerns of Social Security, and my colleagues on the other side have been leaders in talking about the technological changes that would be needed that also could produce from antiquated systems that don't provide the best up-to-date information that we could have. So I concur with the chairman. I thank him. We're looking forward to having a hearing on this where we are able to put the vitality of ideas to the test with both competing programs and what I hope will be a great solution for the American people. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Larson. I appreciate your comments. Mr. Schweikert, do you care to make a comment?
I have a dozen questions. Why don't we wait till?
A dozen questions?
Oh, yeah, I'm going to go fast.
Well, we'll let you have two. How's that? As is customary, any member is welcome to submit a statement for the record. Before we move on to testimony today, I want to remind our witnesses to please limit your oral statement to 5 minutes. However, without objection, all the written testimony will be made part of the hearing. We have one witness today. Seated at the table is Stephen Goss, Chief Actuary, Social Security Administration. Mr. Goss, welcome to our hearing. Thank you for being here. Please proceed.
Thank you very much, Chairman Johnson, Ranking Member Larson, members of the committee, for the opportunity to come and talk to you again about the Social Security Trustees Report and the status of these trust funds. As you all know, the Social Security Trustees Reports have been coming out from the Board of Trustees every single year, starting 1941, updating you on what the status of the program is and what our challenges are in the future to assure that the scheduled benefits will be able to be paid to all future generations on a timely basis and in full. This year, we project the combined OESI and DI trust funds, as Chairman Johnson indicated, to deplete the reserves in 2034, at which point there would still be continuing income coming in to pay thereafter for essentially the indefinite future about 75% of scheduled benefits, not what is desired, and looking forward to fixing that. At that time in 2034, if no changes were made, we would be in a position where we would have 25% lower benefits. So the options really for changes in the future are either to enact changes that will lower benefits by about a third, increase revenues to this program by lower benefits by 25%, increase revenues by about 1/3, or some combination of those two. The two most significant changes in this year's report, already alluded to by the chairman and ranking member, are first of all on the DI solvency side. We're happy to report that the DI solvency side, we have 5-year extension of the period over which we are projecting benefits to be fully payable under the DI program. This follows on from the Bipartisan Budget Act of 2015, where we had the reallocation that moved us from 2016 out to 2022. Last year's Trustees report gave us 1 more year, and this year's report has taken us 5 more years out to 2028. The reasons for this seemingly dramatic extension of 5 years is that we have had continuing, ever since 2010, declining numbers of applications coming in for disability. This is not just for Social Security, but also for SSI. It's really quite remarkable. We are studying hard all the reasons for this. In addition, we've had continuing lower disability incidence rate. That's percentage of people who could be applying for and receiving disability. We're having fewer people actually starting to receive. We've actually had declining numbers of beneficiaries under the DI program since 2013. The absolute number has actually been coming down. So what we're doing this year for our projections is obviously accepting the reality of what's happened lately and projecting out from that on a somewhat more gradual basis, not having the very next year, assume applications will come right back up, but have it take 2, 3, 4 years. What we have done, however, though, with the trustees is we've still maintained the same ultimate disability incidence rates by the end of the 10-year period of the short-range projection period. That's obviously under review. We're going to have to monitor very closely what continues to happen. Now, on the overall solvency of the USDI program, we still have the reserve depletion date for OESI and DI combined 2034. For the OESI program all by itself, the retirement survivors, that's still 2035, the same as last year. We actually have higher reserve levels for the USDI program through about 2033, but the actual deficit for the 75-year period as a whole has risen from 2.66 to 2.83% of payroll. 0.05 of that, about a third of that, is just from the change of the valuation period, bringing in 1 extra year at the end of the 75-year period. Some other things that have contributed to that are the more recent data, like somewhat lower birth rates, lower immigration flows. Offsetting that somewhat, though, is that we've had higher death rates, less improvement in death rates than even we have been projecting, and many have been projecting much more improvement. Ever since 2009, death rates have not been improving that much in this country, as I think all are familiar at this point. We also had a little change that we might talk about more, accepting a slightly lower level of worker productivity for the future. I really do want to comment again because both the chairman and ranking member mentioned the real factor, the reason we're having this big increase over the next 20 years in the Social Security cost is not disability anymore, but it's in the retirement areas. The baby boomers are all moving up into the retirement ages and out of working ages, and they're being replaced at working ages by the lower birth rate generations following, which is fundamentally changing the age distribution of our population going forward. Finally, I really want to say once again that is really a joy and a pleasure working not only with you, but really your excellent staffs. You all have amazing staffs and amazing staff work. I can't tell you how lucky you are on that, but I'm sure you realize it. And we're really looking forward to working with you and them to assure benefits will continue for the over 60 million beneficiaries we have now, the over 170 million workers contributing, and all future generations. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate your testimony, and we'll now turn to questions. As is customary for each round of questions, I will limit my time to 5 minutes and ask my colleagues to also limit their questioning time to 5 minutes as well. Mr. Goss, with the Disability Insurance Trust Fund solvency date shifting 5 years later, some folks may think we don't need to talk about Social Security right now and can just wait. I want to make sure we're all on the same page. Isn't it true that the longer we wait, the harder it gets?
Chairman Johnson, you are entirely correct. The one thing we know, and I think you alluded to at least some of this, is that a perfect example was the 1983 amendments, the last major change we had, where one of the big factors in that was increasing the normal retirement age. That was implemented with a 17-year delay. So if we enact something relatively soon, even if it's not implemented into the future, that gives the people who will be affected lots of advance warning, which is a really good thing. It also allows many more options to be considered than if we wait till the last minute, and it allows us to phase in changes more quickly. So it's all good, enacting sooner, even if there's some delay to implementation.
Thank you, Mr. Goss. One of the big headlines from yesterday's report is the Disability Insurance Trust Fund solvency date. Doubling the program's years of solvency seems like a big change. How confident are you that we aren't just going to lose this additional solvency a few years from now?
Well, there's no question but that there's a risk of that, but our estimates in this point, as with all our estimates, we would say we're about equally likely to have the solvency date extend further as to come back. The tricky part of the Disability Insurance Trust Fund is at this point we have a relatively low level of trust fund reserve, and also our revenue income, even after we get past the tax rate reallocation, compared to our cost of the program are pretty close together. So any significant fluctuation, either one of those, could cause us to deplete sooner or later. But at this point, based on the data we have, the 5-year extension looks pretty solid, and if anything, if applications and incidence rates stay anywhere near as low as they've been lately, we might very well have a greater extension and have need to change our ultimate incidence rates going into the future. But time will tell. We just wish we had the crystal ball to be able to tell you with any certainty.
Well, thank you. We often hear that if we just raise Social Security tax, it'll solve all of Social Security's problems. Yeah, but it's important folks understand the facts. For Social Security, earnings up to a certain amount, called the taxable maximum, are subject to payroll taxes. What's the taxable maximum this year?
For this year, 27, the taxable maximum is $127,200. So anybody
if
making more than
the taxable maximum were raised to cover 90% of earnings, what would the taxable maximum be this year?
To cover 90%, it'd be about double that, right around $250,000, just a little bit less.
Some have suggested we should get rid of the taxable maximum and instead subject all earnings to payroll tax. Mr. Goss, if all earnings were subject to payroll tax, would Social Security be solvent?
It would be solvent longer. It would not be solvent sort of into the indefinite
Okay,
future.
so the answer is no. At what point would costs once again exceed income?
If we were to enact a change with no, let's see, I think I've got these numbers. If we were to enact a change with no benefit credit for the extra, we would actually solve about 80% of the long term, and we would be good to well into the 2060s for the solvency.
20 what?
Into the 2060s. Let's see. Here.
Really?
I'm sorry. No, I'm sorry. If we gave no benefit credit at all and taxed all income, our solvency date would move from 2034 to 2083. Now, if we give benefit credit, if we were to tax all earnings and then include in our computation of benefits the extra earnings that were going to be taxed, then we would extend the solvency date out to 2067 for the program as a whole.
20 what?
2067.
Yeah,
So
I was
either
told
way,
2026.
Pardon?
I was told 2026.
Oh, well, 2026 would be the date at which the annual income would then start to fall below the annual outgo. But we would still have significant reserves at that point that would carry us for solvency purposes out to 2067. So you're exactly right. On a cash flow basis, the point at which income would again fall below our cost of paying all the benefits, which
So the income would reduce to where it wouldn't cover what we're doing.
Right. The current income would not be sufficient. We'd have to be drawing on the reserves.
So even if we get completely rid of the taxable maximum, the program will be running cash flow deficits within the next decade. Is that true?
That's correct.
That sure doesn't get us much, and as I've said before, we clearly can't tax our way to solvency. Mr. Larson, you care to comment?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you, Mr. Goss. Usually when I go out to do town halls, I carry with me two things: the actuary report on the bill that we've submitted and Starbucks. And I do so to make a point. The first point I make to people, and I think you can confer on this, the Social Security is an insurance plan. It's not an entitlement. It's an insurance plan. It's an insurance plan that you are assessed through FICA. FICA is the Federal Insurance Contribution Act. Whose contribution? Yours. The last time insurance premiums went up in Social Security was in 1983. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So has anyone in this audience or anywhere in the country's insurance not gone up on actuarial assumptions since 1983? And the answer, of course, is, of course they've gone up, because they keep pace with the assumptions and changes that are ongoing, except for Social Security. So had, I believe, our predecessors indexed this system appropriately, we wouldn't be having this discussion. It would have been taking care of itself incrementally. So I ask you, as I go out to these town halls, and you've done the analysis on our bill, can you confirm that our bill doesn't have any cuts in terms of people's benefits?
That's correct.
In fact, we increase people's benefits because they also have not kept pace. In fact, we find more people retiring into poverty, unfortunately, most of them women, because of their time in the workforce, or because for every dollar their male counterparts receive, they got 77 cents. Is that accurate?
No question, but that all wage rates are lower for women.
And also, we wanted to make sure with our program that we would offer middle-income tax relief for seniors. And I know this will interest my colleagues. How is it that you have tax relief for seniors? Well, because, again, we haven't made a change since 1983. In 1983, we said if you're single and making more than $25,000, your Social Security is taxed. And if you're a married couple, and it's $32,000. So we changed that to $50,000 and $100,000, thereby giving 11 million seniors a tax break. So we think that these are all important things. And the differences, and I don't think they're big differences, actually. I understand clearly the desire on both sides to make sure that the nation's insurance program is solvent beyond 75 years, which, again, by your report, the bill that we've submitted does. Mr. Johnson's bill does that as well, too. It makes it solvent beyond the 75-year period. That's the position we need. The differences are that we believe that with a modest tax, and we believe that you should increase the fund by 1%. You said it very well at the outset when you said, well, look, here's your alternatives. You can make cuts by about a third, I believe you said.
By about a quarter.
By about a quarter. You could then, what were the three?
Revenue by about a third.
Revenue by a third, or
some of each.
Or some of each. So we believe that especially with so many people finding themselves in the position where Social Security is their only retirement that they have. Now, we can lecture them and say that you should have been wiser, but tell that to people who saw in 2008 their 401ks become 101ks through no fault of their own. And yet, the one program that isn't going to fail them, that is there and never missed a payment, is Social Security. So I believe that between the intelligence that we have on this committee, that we have an opportunity to solve. I thank the chairman because Rich Neal pointed out to me the other day, we have not, and Mr. Johnson says this all the time, really taken this on as a committee in more than 25 years. We've postponed any kind of difficult decision as it relates to this. And now, as you pointed out, the baby boomers are upon us. I think we have a moral obligation to take action. Whatever that outcome is, whatever this committee thinks the best alternative is, we ought to have that competition and we ought to have a vote. And I thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Schweikert, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And it's actually, don't make fun of me. It was this hearing that was one of my primary reasons I wanted to be on Ways and Means. And I have a dozen different things that are bouncing in my head, and then you always get the things from your really smart staff that says, don't ask that. But on your team, do you actually have a demographer, someone it basically does population statistics?
We do indeed. We have 57 folks in our office. We have about 6 or 7 economists, in addition to actuaries, and we have 4 or 5 demographers, full-time, all the time, working on demography.
Would you ever allow me to geek out with one of them? There's a couple things in the numbers that have always bothered me, and part of this actually is where everyone on the committee has been trying to understand with the crash in the birth rates, and you saw what the report from this first quarter of the year, we've hit an all-time low, and a cascade effect of those sorts of birth rates for future generations. And I am curious because in sometimes reading over your documents, I'm not sure I'm seeing the stressing of today's birth rate, if it were to hold, in sort of the long-term numbers. And I just want to see that that's being properly modeled.
Oh, we would love to. We've never been called geeks before. I don't think we would love to geek out.
Oh, I mean that with love. I truly mean that.
On all of this material.
Can-
and we do have a sensitivity section in the trustees report that actually explores what if the total fertility rate stayed low forever.
Will
So
you
we do
ever
have
allow someone to have your sensitivity analysis on, I don't know what program you write it, but to make it available for one of us who would just like to online play with it and move some numbers up and down? Because we've had discussions here of, as we're doing tax reform and other things, would any of those have any influence in population growth or even immigration reform, population growth, and the ability to also see the cascade benefits or stresses from that?
Oh, absolutely. The models are pretty complicated. We would be really happy to sit down with you, your staff, anybody, and work through the implications. We have scored comprehensive immigration reform plans. There was one in the Senate a couple years ago.
That was almost 10 years ago when you did that scoring, isn't it?
Been a while, 2011, I think maybe.
Okay.
But we have all these cascading effects built in.
I actually have
to
that
those
in one of my
estimates.
binders. Now can I ask something that's a little uncomfortable? On the DI numbers, and please forgive me because I was doing this partially with your information, partially on my own. The mortality statistics on some of the male population who were enrolled in DI, how much of the extension and the longevity is because we have so many of our brothers, particularly, killing themselves?
That's a really good question. We do have built into our disability projections mortality as one of the ways in which people cease receiving benefits, of course.
But isn't that the point where you saw some real noise between last year and this year?
We saw some noise. It's relatively modest. We've been seeing, ever since 2009, small increments of death rates being higher than we've been projecting, and we've been modifying for that. But those have had very small effects. For the program as a whole, I think it was on the order of 0.03 or 0.04% of payroll
Okay,
effect.
so that's about half
And
of
so
what I
for
thought.
so for DI, it'd be much less than that.
Okay, good.
It's true that
It was just one of those, you see some of the statistics of the population of the current mortality rates, and then sometimes you'll come across another number set that says how many of those were actually enrolled in DI programs. And we've been struggling saying, is that in the noise? Okay, and I'm trying to watch my time. On big Social Security, 176 million of workers in our society, 60 million receiving benefits today. So our ratio now is 2.9.
Roughly. I think it's 62,
workers.
172, but it's,
Yeah, so it's 2.9 workers for every beneficiary. But also, even if I take your current number on numbers of years left in the trust fund, so if I'm 56 I should expect if I take my retirement at, what, 72, I'm getting a 25% discount unless we do our job and change the numbers.
That's true. But we have total confidence changes because we've never hit that point ever in the past.
But the hard math as of your report today
Yep.
is a 56-year-old or younger, when they go to retire and pull their max benefit, they would be receiving a 25% reduction in that benefit.
Yep.
So just sort of put it in perspective of, we got a long on-ramp, but we need to start getting on that freeway now. And the beauty of this is whether you be on the right or the left, functionally it's math with a number of levers. This is something we can all do together. Just one other idiosyncrasy, could you tell me the formula, just at the best year, of the spiff that's paid for the special treasury bills back to the trust fund?
Yes. So every penny that comes into the system is required to be invested immediately into interest-bearing securities backed by the full faith and credit of the U.S. government. There are a couple of options. We could actually buy marketable securities. Lately, we've been getting special issues to the trust fund. Any special issue to the trust fund that is provided in a given month, the coupon rate on that is precisely what Treasury measures as the average effective market yield on all outstanding marketable Treasury securities as of the prior month, with a remaining duration to call or maturity of 4 years or more.
4 years or more.
4 years or more. So it's a medium to long-term yield rate. The actual effective market yield
Is?
So there's no right now.
Because a year ago I
The
did the
gentleman's
calculation, it
time
was
has
3.1.
expired.
I'm
Mr.
sorry, I'm way
Buchanan,
over
you're
time.
recognized.
Yeah.
But
And
if
if-
you know what, do you know what your number is right now?
The number, I believe it's in, for the new issues, I believe it's in the twos.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Sorry for going over.
Mr. Buchanan, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate you coming back. I've been on the committee for a while, so we always kind of like your updates. I'm from Sarasota, Bradenton, Florida. We represent probably, I think, the top 2 or 3 most seniors of any district in the country, and of course, Florida in general. So I'm concerned about all the seniors, but I'm also concerned about our children and grandchildren. I have 4 grandchildren under 3, so I'm very concerned. I'm glad we're looking out 75 years. But let me, and I do want to, my colleague had mentioned there is a lot of truth, and I see it every day. I did a town hall the other day. A third of Americans, when they get 65, I've heard, don't have anything but Social Security and Medicare. Another third have something, but not enough. And then another third got lucky or whatever. And so that's why these programs, and I agree, are so critical that we do the right thing. I want to ask, because this is maybe a more sensitive issue for some people, but the reality, and these are things I do a lot of town halls that I get. The trust fund. In the 60s, they took all the money out of it, so there's an IOU from the federal government. Is that correct?
I believe for the entirety of the existence of the program, it has been required that we invest.
Let me ask it a different way. How much money is there ideally, in theory, in the trust fund?
Well, it depends on the way in which you all formulate the laws, the way in which it should be funded.
My understanding, there's nothing in the trust fund other than an IOU from the federal government because they use those funds. That's my general understanding. In the 60s, that's kind of what I hear. So my concern is, and I'm sure you don't take a look at that, when you look at the viability of Social Security to 3032 or 3034, you're taking into account the ability of the government to be able to do its part and pay back the trust fund. Is that correct?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So when you're running the last 10 years, $10 trillion worth of debt and deficits. I've been pushing since I've been here a constitutional balanced budget amendment like 49 out of 50 governors have that simply says you don't spend more than you take in. But if you look 10 years ago when I got here, it was almost $9 trillion in debt. Today we're $20 trillion in debt. So when you look at the viability of Social Security, you're counting on the ability of the federal government to meet its obligations. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, I just want to make sure that's on the record, because I think it is something we got to deal with, especially when you look at, and there's plenty of blame to go around. This isn't a Democrat or Republican issue, but I think it should be something that gets looked at. As a business person, the ability to pay, and as a guy that was on bank boards, we look at that seriously. Let me get down to couple of basic issues. On COLA, I get asked by a lot of the seniors, I guess we got a little bit of an increase, 0.3 of 1%. The year before, nothing. And then there were some increases over the years. The argument I hear is, look, our costs in the last couple of years have gone up. We're not seeing anything extra in COLA. How are you guys figuring this COLA? So maybe you can comment. So last year was little or nothing, and the year before it was nothing in terms of COLA. Where are we at today? Or how can you explain what's taken place in the last couple of years?
Well, our latest projection, and very uncertain, of course, is for the next COLA December this year at 2.2%. We will see. We determine the COLA base straight up on the basis of the material that comes from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. They do the survey of urban wage earners and clerical workers, a big survey across the country of how much the prices of the market basket of things that they buy changes over time. And when the price of things that they buy goes down, as it did 2 COLAs ago, we end up not having any adjustment. Last year we had a small adjustment because the prices came back to somewhat higher than it had been 2 years
And then
prior.
what are you projecting this year?
We're projecting this year 2.2%.
So is that fair? If seniors asked me, the projection's 2.2. Is there a fairly good chance that's going to be somewhat a reality?
Probably somewhere between 1.5 and 2.5
Okay.
would be a good guess, because there's a lot of uncertainty. And the thing that has really driven the volatility of prices in this market basket in recent years is the price of energy, in particular of petroleum products. And we continue to see lots of fluctuations that every time we go to the gas pump. So that's really been kind of the issue. But we are expecting on the order of a couple of percent for this next upcoming COLA.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Pascrell. You're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for putting us together and being one of the pioneers to say, let's prepare for the future.
Thank you.
I think that's important. And I've traveled with Brother Larson to many communities to talk about the legislation that my friend from Connecticut has talked about. But I'm alarmed, Mr. Chairman. I'm alarmed at the fact that the budget that was presented this year, the new Foundation for American Greatness, that was the title of the book, which contained the budget, had $64 billion cut in disability, Social Security disability. And I know that you don't directly deal with that. But that was alarming to me in view of us trying to package something. I mean, we may say we have 16, 17 years to do this, but I don't know if that's accurate or not. But about the COLA, that we can talk about. And what we need to understand in dealing with Social Security issue is that COLA is very important for seniors who live on fixed income. Now that COLA should represent, to me, the actual expenses that seniors have to put up with day in and day out. And said that, you know, there are so many exceptions to the rule, and it's so antiquated, the formula that we use. We never capture what that COLA is because we're afraid to deal with the reality of, well, how do we address that in terms of cutting checks for people every month? And I paid into it, I paid into it, you've paid into it, and we want a fair return at the end. The legislation that the gentleman from Connecticut has talked about reflects it. The legislation is right on concerning how we will adjust that COLA to be more realistic about what seniors get in that check that was cut, wherever it was cut. And would you agree with me?
I believe Mr. Larson's bill would change to the CPIE for experimental,
Right.
some people say, or for the, it's based on 62 and over population's market basket of purchases.
Let me ask you this, Mr. Goss. First of all, is Social Security bankrupt?
By any normal meaning of the word, I think we would have to say no. As Chairman Johnson and others have said, even if we reach the point of reserve depletion, we still will be able to pay
Right.
initially 77,
Okay.
more or less on the order of 75
And,
cents on
and,
the
and
dollar.
it appears through those same numbers that we're not on the verge of bankruptcy.
Certainly.
No, we're not bankrupt today, but we're going to be bankrupt tomorrow. No, we can't say that right now. Has Congress needed to shore up Social Security, the trust fund in the past?
Numerous times, and it's always stepped up.
Have the actions of Congress, that the Congress took in the past to shore up the trust fund, we hear a lot about that, resulted in any substantial benefit cuts?
It has at times. The principal benefit reduction was actually back in the 1977 amendments, when there was actually a need for a major change in the benefit formula. But there were, in the 1983 amendments, there was a mix between additional revenue and benefit reductions.
Has Social Security ever failed to pay anyone's benefits?
Social Security has never reached the point of reserve depletion and failed to pay the scheduled benefits on a timely basis.
What I think your answers are, and I'll be very quick, Mr. Chairman, it says to me that Congress will need to take action to extend the trust fund solvency, but we do not need to cut benefits or substantially restructure the program to do this. Would you agree with that?
It is certainly possible to extend the solvency without benefit reductions.
Mr. Chairman, thank you, and good luck on your endeavor.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Rice, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. They've called for votes, so I'm going to be quick. There are a whole lot of major issues that are facing this country that have been over our heads for a long time, and I believe are holding our economy back. Tax reform, health care, infrastructure, but none more important to more people than Social Security. It affects such a large swath of our population. It's so critical to their everyday life. One question that was referred to earlier that I get all the time, but I want you to state this in more simple terms for the folks back home. I frequently hear, well, Social Security would be all right if the federal government hadn't robbed the Social Security bank. In fact, the money comes in, and it's in a trust fund. And I always respond, the only problem with federal trust funds is that they're not funded and you can't trust them. But that being said, you have to invest that money. You don't just leave it in a closet. You got to invest it. And with dealing with Social Security, you want to invest it in something that's rock solid, like something backed by the full faith and credit of the U.S. government. So you loan the money to the government. Now, is the government cheating Social Security in any way in that transaction?
The government, there's no way we could say the government is cheating Social Security. Every penny that's ever gone to the trust fund, when it is needed, it comes back with interest.
And I have
Always
looked
has.
at the rate that the government pays Social Security on that trust fund. And in the last decades, that rate has averaged higher than the government pays on the 10-year Treasury bill. Can you confirm that?
The rate, the holdings we have in the trust fund, many of them were issued years ago when the rates were actually higher. So we retained those bonds until we redeemed them at the higher rates.
So
the average yield is higher than the current new issue rate.
So the government, in borrowing money from Social Security, could borrow it from other places cheaper. The government could go and borrow that money on the market for a 10-year Treasury bill cheaper than the rate that it's paying to Social Security.
Well, actually, for new money to be borrowed today from the trust funds or from the market, they pay exactly the same rate for new money that is being borrowed. For older existing bonds, they are paying us possibly a higher rate, but if somebody in the populace is holding a marketable treasury that's 10 years old, they'll be getting a higher rate also.
But just to be crystal clear, and I don't want to complicate this for my folks back home, the rate that the government has paid to the Social Security Trust Fund to borrow that money from the Social Security Trust Fund is higher for the last 2 decades than what the government pays on the 10-year Treasury bill.
I respectfully would suggest that the rate, any new bond that is issued is issued with a coupon rate exactly equivalent to what the current effective market yield is.
Hey, that's new
on all
bonds.
outstanding.
But on the whole pile, the average rate,
The average rate for existing bonds that we're holding is higher than the current effective market yield for bonds.
thank you, sir.
As we've heard today, even with the improvements in the solvency of disability insurance, Social Security faces serious challenges, and Americans deserve a fact-based conversation about the tough choices necessary. Social Security is a program our children and grandchildren can count on, just as seniors and individuals with disabilities do today. I look forward to continuing this conversation and working with all my colleagues to strengthen Social Security. Thank you to our witness for his testimony. Thank you also to our members for being here. With that, the subcommittee stands adjourned.